So let's talk about the archaeological discoveries that support the Bible. So there have been thousands and thousands of archaeological discoveries over the past century that have verified the historical reliability of the Bible. And so I'm just going to give you a few examples, just a few from thousands. Okay, first I want to talk about King David. So interestingly, before 1993, there had actually never been found any archaeological evidence about King David. Okay, King David, we read about him in the Bible. He wrote a lot of the Psalms. Okay, we know all the stories about King David, David and Goliath, right? So he was a man after God's own heart. He was one of the most famous kings of all of the Jewish kings, right? And until 1993, nobody had ever found any archaeological proof or support that this King David ever even existed. And so because of that, there were many historians and skeptics who dismissed David as a mythological character, that he was nothing more than a figure of religious and political mythology. Okay, and that all changed in 1993. And that's really, really recent, when a nearly 3,000-year-old inscription was discovered in the ancient ruins of the city of Dan. Dan is mentioned in the Bible. And this inscription mentions David, the king of Israel. Let me show you what it looked like. So here it is. So this is this ancient inscription. Okay, and I think that place that's white right there, you see that? I think that's where it says. So what it says is David, the king of Israel. Okay, and it is on display today at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So this was an amazing discovery only as late as 1993. So because before then, again, there had been nothing. And now, for the very first time, we have this verification that King David was an actual historical figure. Okay. Even Time magazine has admitted now that the skeptics' claim that King David never existed is now hard to defend. So if you can get a liberal magazine like Time to admit that, this is undeniable, incontrefutable evidence that King David was actually a real historic character outside of what we read about him in the Bible. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is Pontius Pilate. Okay, so you know the story of Pontius Pilate, right? We learn about him in the Gospels. He was the Roman governor of Judea at the time of Jesus. He oversaw Jesus's trial and then sentenced him to death by crucifixion. So you know the whole story, how he then tried to wash his hands of it and say that he let the Jewish people and the religious leaders have what they were yelling out for. So was Pilate a famous legendary figure? Well, actually, not really, because until 1961, nobody had ever found any proof of Pilate's existence either. But in 1961, so again, relatively recently, archaeologists were digging in Caesarea on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea in Israel, and they uncovered a limestone block that bore an inscription in Latin that dated to the early part of the 1st century, and it mentioned Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. And here is that. I'll show you a picture of it. And that is in Latin, and so it's that second line right there. And that says Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. This inscription verifies that Pontius Pilate was an actual historical person. And not only that, but that he reigned in the same position that we are told he did in the Gospels. Okay, he was a prefect, right? Which means he would have had the authority to condemn or to pardon prisoners, Jesus, just as the Gospels tell us. So that was a very, very important archaeological discovery as well. So this is what I'm talking about, how all of these archaeological discoveries, a lot of them very recent, continue to give more and more support to the stories that we read about in the Bible. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about in detail, these archaeological discoveries, is crucifixion itself. Okay, because we learn in the Bible, of course, that according to the Bible, Jesus was crucified, and when he was crucified, that nails were pounded into his wrists and into his feet onto the cross, right? So that's what the Bible tells us. Okay, but for many, many, many years, critics did not believe that crucifixions with nails ever took place in Israel in the first century because they simply had not found any evidence, any archaeological evidence that this had ever happened. So they didn't believe it. So skeptics, scholars, they dismissed the crucifixion story for so many years that it was either inaccurate or untrue because they had never found any archaeological discoveries that supported this. But that all changed in 1968. Okay, so another recent discovery when a crew of builders accidentally discovered an ancient Jewish cemetery in Jerusalem. And in this cemetery, it contained the remains of several men who were killed during the Jewish revolt against Rome in around AD 70. Okay. In one of the bone ossuaries, so they would store the bones of these people in these boxes that were called ossuaries. And one of those contained the skeleton of a young man who his name was even inscribed on it. His name was Yohanan ben Hagalgal. But the most stunning part of this find was that they could see how the man had died. He was put to death by crucifixion with nails. And how do we know that? We know that because his heel bone actually still had the nail through the bone. Okay, I know this is pretty grisly, but it's so fascinating. So there's a close-up. So I'm going to show you a closer picture version of this picture, of this grisly picture. Anyway, look at this. So the center there is the heel bone. And then you can see horizontally the iron nail that was going through the middle of the heel bone. Okay, now normally the Roman soldiers would remove the nails after the men who had been crucified, after they had died, because iron nails were expensive. But they were not able to get this, to remove this nail. And you can see why. See the end of it right here is bent over. So probably what happened when they were nailing this nail into the cross, it must have hit a knot or in the wood or something, and it bent this over. So they weren't able to pull the nail out after this person died. So this is, too bad and sad for the person who actually was crucified, but it's wonderful for us because finally we had some hard evidence, archaeological evidence that yes, indeed, crucifixions were taking place in Israel during this time with nails, just like we are told in the Gospels. Okay, so this is just amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. So those are the three that I want to talk about in detail, but I want to tell you just a very quick list of some other archaeological discoveries, what they include. So we have found evidence of the ancient extra biblical accounts of a catastrophic flood, okay, that we read about in Genesis, of course. Remember this guy? Here's this guy again, King Sennacherib. Well, we've actually found his palace he was the king of Assyria. And we have found a wall relief that depicts the Assyrian siege on Lachish that we read about in 2 Kings and Isaiah. We have found evidence of the Hittite people, which the Bible talks about a lot in the Old Testament, but until 1876. So very recently, no archaeological evidence had ever been found of these mysterious Hittite people. Okay, and skeptics use things like this to discount the Bible and to say, oh, well, I guess they were just making that up, right? But then in 1876, they found evidence of the Hittite people. And since then, they have found so much evidence of the vastness of the Hittite nation and its influence over all of the ancient world. And so now it has become common knowledge. Okay, and this is just since the late 1800s. We have found Jericho. Okay, the ruins of Jericho, along with evidence that the city wall fell down flat at the very time the Old Testament dates the crossing of the Hebrew people into Canaan, which was around 1400 BC. That would have been when Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, okay? Crazy. We have found Hezekiah's tunnel that we learn about in 2 Kings. King Hezekiah built this tunnel to secretly channel water into the city of Jerusalem around 700 BC. We have found the ancient ruins of Babylon that we read about in the book of Daniel and many of the books in the Old Testament. We have found ruins of King Nebuchadnezzar's palaces, his temples, his city walls, houses, and inscriptions mentioning Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. We also have found the Babylonian Chronicle tablets that I showed you a picture of a little bit ago. We have found the Pool of Siloam. That is where Jesus sent the blind man with mud on his eyes to wash and receive healing. We have found Jacob's well. And earlier this year, several months ago, I showed you a picture of Jacob's well. You can actually go visit Jacob's well in Samaria. It is still there. And that is where Jesus met the Samaritan woman. Okay, we also read about it in the Old Testament when it was first dug by Jacob. We have found the pool of Bethesda. And this is where Jesus told the man who had been lame for 38 years to pick up your mat and walk. We have found Herod's palace. This is where John the Baptist was imprisoned and beheaded. We have found Caiaphas, a bone ossuary that has an inscription with the name of Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest, who presided over the nighttime trial right after Jesus was arrested. We have found the Capernaum synagogue, which is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus often taught. We have found, and last but not least, in Megiddo, which is in Israel, there is an early Christian church, and they have found a mosaic tile floor that says the church was built in the memory of the God, Jesus Christ. And so this is evidence that early Christians did believe that Jesus was God, as we read about in the Acts and in the New Testament. So now these are only a handful. Remember, we have thousands of archaeological discoveries that back up the Bible. And a lot of those are very, very recent, the more that is discovered, the more proof we have. We just keep getting more and more proof all the time. There's some very, very recent things that I haven't even talked about tonight. In fact, there have been no discoveries, archaeological discoveries, that directly conflict with anything that we read about in the Bible. So, and today, the volume of archaeological discoveries that support the Bible is just simply overwhelming. It's overwhelming. So you can be very confident that what you are reading about in the Bible has much, much archaeological support.